Hi, I'm Margaret Matijasevic, the Executive Director for the National Conference for Catechetical Leadership, and today I have with me Neil Parent. Can you tell us a little bit about who you are, Neil?
Thank you, Margaret. Well, I was, as you know, the former Executive Director of NCCL, and before that I was for 12 years at the Bishop's National Office, the USCC, as it was called in those days.
So today I have with me a visionary in the realm of catechesis. What a privilege today. Thank you, Neil.
Well, thank you for having me, Margaret.
Before we get started, the National Conference for Catechetical Leadership wanted to extend gratitude to Paulist Evangelization Ministries for their help in producing the video. Thank you very much, especially to Frank DeCiano. So, as we move forward into this great conversation about the institutional memory of the National Conference for Catechetical Leadership, Neil, I was wondering, could we start with how did professional catechetical leaders gather? What's our story? How did we begin meeting together?
He had this idea that the National Center could really serve the bishop's need as the chief teachers of catechesis, but also be a convening force for these diocesan directors. They would gather annually, and that would be, as they eventually did, take place the second Sunday after, or actually the first Sunday after Easter. And so they would meet that week and basically do the work of the National Center.
So Neil, we regularly have these diocesan directors gathering now with
That's
the insight
correct.
of this bishop. And then they gather annually, right after Easter. But then what happens? Because somehow we get constructed into an organization.
Then, Margaret, in 1966, the national directors, at their meeting in New Orleans, decided that they really would like to have their own organization, and that they felt they could actually do more for catechesis nationally than if they were just simply part or being convened by the National Center. So at that meeting, it was Father Bill Tobin, who was then the diocesan director for the Confraternity of Christian Doctrine in New York, who made a motion that they form their own organization. And the motion got approved. And so later that year, at the National Catechetical Congress, which was taking place in Pittsburgh, and that Congress was taking place every 5 years, but that year, which took place in Pittsburgh, representatives from the diocesan directors went and met with the Bishop's Committee for the Confraternity of Christian Doctrine, and they said, look, this is what we're interested in, would you support us? And the bishops did. And so with their permission, they were able then the following year to formally launch what became known as the National Conference for Diocesan Directors of Religious Education / CCD. That was the formal incorporating name.
Of the first national organization.
For the first national organization that was now on their own, yes. And so they kept the Confraternity of Christian Doctrine identity, but they also picked up the more common terminology that was then in vogue, namely religious education. Okay, right. Catechesis had not yet quite hit there yet.
Right.
It would come.
I have a couple of questions about some of the facts there. One, I'm hearing a lot of fathers and bishops involved. Who were the primary grouping of these diocesan directors? Were they all ordained?
The membership of the diocesan directors, if you want to call that, was almost exclusively priest. So priest headed up each diocesan office for the Confraternity of Christian Doctrine. And in the late 60s, that began to change because, I know that as a fact, because Jane Wilford Hughes, who was then the Director of Adult Faith Formation for the Archdiocese of Detroit, told me she attended one of the meetings and she was the only woman in the room.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so
it seems
when they
kind
got
of fitting.
going.
1966, big movements happening in the church with Vatican II.
Yes.
And this shift in identifying ourselves as an independent organization. And now you're saying women coming in at the tail end of the 60s, at least one woman entering the room.
And, 1966 is a very important year, too, because it was the year that the bishops decided, as a result of the impetus of the Second Vatican Council, that they needed to form now a national conference of Catholic bishops. So remember, it was the National Welfare Council.
Right.
So what they did was they created a bicameral organization. So one was the NCCB, the National Conference of Catholic Bishops, which took care of the internal side of the bishop's agenda, liturgy, sacraments, canon law, and those kinds of things. And then they had the USCC, United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, or yes, Catholic Conference, I should say, the Catholic Bishops nomenclature comes in later. And that took care of the external oriented things, social justice, schools, catechesis, and so forth. And so the National Center for the Confrontation of Christian Doctrine was housed on that side of the USCC.
Thank you, Neil, for articulating our position within the USCC. But now I'm wondering, how are we organized as this new independent organization, the National Conference of Diocesan Directors? How did we function internally? How did we operate ourselves?
What they did, Margaret, is they do what all organizations do. When needing staff, you start a search process. So they did that. And that's where I kind of come into the picture, because a phone call came to me from Jean Marie Weber, the president, and said, Neil, we're interested in your applying for this position we have of executive secretary. And I must confess that I really wasn't that interested, because from my vantage point at the USCC, I thought that the organization really had a number of major challenges facing it. You spoke just a moment ago about the development in the field, the emergence of parish DREs, all of that kind of stuff. And I felt that the organization, as exclusively diocesan directors and their staff, was not big enough. It was not a big enough tent to embrace all the new players in the field, parish DREs and organizations that had a related role. And what about the academics that were teaching catechesis? And what about the publishers who in fact were producing the catechetical materials? It seemed to me all those voices could benefit from hearing each other within the same organization. So I thought, I don't think so. I don't think this is going to work. Plus, I saw another phenomenon, and that was the role of executive secretary, to my advantage at the USCC, was very weak, because when we would have the Committee on Education meetings with the bishops and so forth present, the executive secretary was never present there. It was always the president who would fly in. And that meant that the staff then didn't know how to relate to the executive secretary, because it didn't seem that that role had much leverage, much ability to speak on behalf of the organization.
I see. So the local person for the organization wasn't ever in the decision-making room. The president would fly in.
The president would fly in and sit there at the bishop's meeting on education. That is correct.
So the secretary role you were viewing as weak.
It was weak.
And now we're putting out a search for a new secretariat.
That's correct. And so my initial response was, I don't think so. You've got a lot of needs that you have to address, and I don't think that that would be something that I could do as an executive secretary. So originally wasn't very interested, but the executive committee was persistent, and they kept coming back and saying, yeah, but we really want you to apply for it. Can't you at least talk to us? So I did. I went to Milwaukee and met with the executive committee, and it was also not just me. There were other candidates they were interviewing, and I went there with the idea that, well, at least I'll tell them what's on my mind, what I think needs to be done, if I think they're going to grow and become the kind of organization I think that would make a more major impact on catechesis in the country. And so that took place. To my surprise, the executive committee said, well, despite all your reservations about us as an organization, we would like to hire you.
So what did you tell them? To have them call you and say that?
Well, I told them all the things I thought were wrong. So it's not exactly the best way to get a job.
Right, everything you don't do in an interview is what Neil Parent did.
Yeah, that's right, what I did.
Interview.
That's correct. Well, I thought, I wanted to be truthful. I had a job. I wanted them, I thought the organization was a good one, but it really was not addressing the current situation.
Reality.
That's right. And so, to my surprise, they called me back up and said, well, we've interviewed several people, but we want you to apply for this job. And so I said, well, maybe this is something we should talk over more seriously, but I would only do it with the whole board. So it's not going to be just the executive committee. I want to meet with the whole board.
And how big again was that board?
It was about 42 people.
So, a person interviewing for a job says everything wrong with an organization and gets a call back, then puts himself in front of 40-some people. I mean, who does that? That seems like
a crazy person. I think. I think that. Well, it was again. I felt so strongly that the organization had to change, and I had these ideas because I could perceive it for 12 years from my vantage point at the USCC, and organizational development was something that I had an interest in. So I brought a certain learning from reading the literature and so forth. And so I met with the board, and I told them the board was too big. I told them that the field had changed. They had to consider, as I mentioned a little earlier, all these other players. I told them the position for executive secretary is too weak, and therefore a non-entity when it came to representing the organization at the USCC meetings. And all of that would have to change. And if they were interested in me, these are the preconditions, if you will,
Wow.
for my accepting the job. And so they dismissed me, said go take a walk, and then invited me back after, I don't know, it was a half hour or something. And a spokesperson, I guess it was Jean Marie Weber, said on behalf of the board, we want to hire you. And we'll go ahead and ask you to start helping us redefine the new organization. So that's where it began.
What an inspirational interview process. I can't even imagine what that was like to be either yourself or one of the board members, to hear you name the reality so blatantly, you know, and what kind of self-reflection that caused in the room for that 30 minutes. I'm just saying, wow, that's amazing to reflect on. But I'm wondering, Neil, they hire you.
They did.
And all of a sudden, you must have shaken up the whole process. What did NCDD look like?
Well, what we had in place was already that critical success factor A that was working on reorganization.
Right.
And that was meeting, I think, this meeting, by the way, with the whole board was in October in Cleveland. And that group was going to meet to, again, discuss reorganization issues in November or early December. And then the board was going to meet again in January.
Wow, that's quick.
So what I knew I wanted to do was to take advantage of that critical success factor group meeting. There were 6 people on it, 3 men, 3 women, chaired by Don Curry from Grand Island, Nebraska, and to see if I could put before them a proposal about how the organization might look, okay? And if they bought into it, they could send it on to the board in January, which was going to meet in Malibu, California. And if that board approved it, it could go to the membership in Louisville in the spring of 1991.
Wow. So you moved quickly.
It had to be 4 months. So I really wanted. And what was behind that, Margaret, was my feeling is, having observed organizational changes, your best hope is always to move quickly, because the longer you're there, the harder it is.
Right.
People start to dig in and so forth. But when you're fresh and there's a certain sense of movement in the air, things can happen quickly. So that's where I was going. So what I did was I started on December 2nd, 1990. And I went to work immediately researching how nonprofits looked in that particular area. And I got all this information from the American Society of Association Executives. And I redefined the board down to 18 members. So it would be constituency based. You would have, for example, 4 seats for diocesan directors, 2 seats for associate directors, a seat for Eastern churches, a seat for Hispanics, a seat for academics, and so on and so forth. And but I was told in the very early stages that, gee, we don't want to lose. Yes, our board is too big, but we don't want to lose this provincial network we have. And so what I was able to do was to conceive of a sort of independent adjunct organization, which we eventually called the Representative Council. So it would be those 37 and now even larger members, because it was no longer just going to be the representatives of those provinces. We were going to include parish DRE representatives from their organizations. We were going to include affiliated organizations. We were going to include some of the other people that were not on the board but needed to be part of the discussion. And so I conceived of it as operating adjacent to the board, if you will, even geographically. So I had in my mind that this group would be our think tank. They would be the people that would be the brainstormers. They would be thinking through the big idea issues about catechesis, where we needed to go, how to need to get there. They would be rooted to the members through the provinces, and the members would feed in their ideas. And then they would come and together they would massage those ideas and see where the organization was going, or where catechesis was going, or where perhaps the latest document from the Vatican needed to be addressed and how it should be addressed.
Wow. So
all of these things need to be done in that group. And the benefit would be that that group would give the wisdom of their thinking to the board, as the board governed the organization, you see. So you would have the board working on governance, the representative council being the networking agency for all the representatives from the provinces plus those affiliated organizations, but thinking through the big issues, the blue sky people, so to speak.
Wow,
you know what I
yeah.
mean? Right. And then they would then, at their meeting, sort of at the end of the meeting, they would reach their conclusions, and they would share those conclusions with the board leadership and say, okay, here's where you've asked us to go with some of these issues you're interested in as our governance people, and here's our responses to them. Or here are other issues we thought about that you didn't ask, but we're thinking you need to address as a board, because you know these are issues we see emerging from our provinces. So all of that kind of would go on, and then the board would then thank them and say to the board meeting, okay guys, we've got this intellectual capital, this wonderful information from our representative council, and now let's go to work. What do we need to do by virtue of policy and so forth? So I had a clearer distinction than actually worked out.
Right. So the visionary group would inform the board of all of their great insights to help them drive the board to create policy or vision into the future of how to address all of these realities and dreams. And then that rep council would also go back to their province then to also address the dreams and the vision, right?
And to the respective organizations. So because
that
now
makes sense,
you
right?
now had affiliated organizations.
Yeah, great. So now we have a structure for a board process representing different provinces from all over the nation. We're housed in the USCC, but tell me more about how that grew. What did our position in the USCC look like at this point as we began to get more members and began to grow?
So what the diocesan directors decided to do to organize themselves, since each of those diocesan directors were part of provinces, was to say, let's create a board in which we will have one representative from each of our ecclesiastical provinces, of which I think there were about 37, maybe 38. So one representative of each of those provinces would come together along with officers that we're going to elect. And there will be a president, a vice president, a secretary, and a treasurer. So about 41, 42 people made up the board. And there was no staff, so the board basically was the organization. They came together, they brought in reports from the provinces, they conducted business, and then their business oftentimes went back to the provinces so the provinces could know what was going on nationally. And many of those provinces, Margaret, also had their own agendas. They were producing materials for their own needs within their provinces and so forth. And that, in turn, filtered up to the board meetings. So as a board, they could create agendas for issues that they wanted to conduct and to develop on behalf of catechesis nationally.
But just to clarify then, Neil, the members of the organization were all board members. Nobody beyond that board member from the province could be a member of the organization?
Oh, no. Remember, it was all diocesan directors.
Right.
So you're talking one representative from an ecclesiastical province.
I see.
That's the board. So back in the province, you had other diocesan directors who were serving their respective dioceses.
Right.
At the beginning, it was just diocesan directors. Okay. But then over the years, they began to invite in associate members.
I see.
Diocesan staff, though, only. Okay. So the membership grew from 200 and something to maybe 300 or 400 as they began to add associate directors as well to their membership.
Great. So the offices in religious education started to grow. The membership started to grow. But it was exclusively for diocesan staffs.
It was diocesan staff. That is correct.
Okay. This inquiring mind now wants to know. There's two organizations.
Yes.
You observe something happening, and it's something that you said you want to share with me, so I want to know what it is.
Oh, yes.
Two people sharing an office, two women now, which I might note that's an
Oh,
interesting
yes,
shift.
that's correct.
From all ordained to now two women.
Yes. And by the way,
Sharing an office.
Suzanne Huff was the first female executive secretary.
Oh, great.
Because all her predecessors were priests.
Wow. So these two women out of the USCC sharing an office here at St. Paul's, but something happens. What happens?
Well, it was interesting from my vantage point at the USCC to observe this. The youth organization, and that had been CYO and youth ministry and so forth, working out of the USCC office, redefined themselves. And they renamed themselves the National Federation for Catholic Youth Ministry. And as a result of changes, they were able to quickly grow and actually leave that joint space.
So you're saying they created a new identity for themselves.
They did.
Which allowed them to thrive.
Yeah, they were no longer part of the bishop's office. So they basically created a new way of being, so to speak, about themselves as an organization. And that enabled them to really grow. By contrast, the NCDD kept the same organizational structure. That big board, the 30 or 42 member board, and so on and so forth. And reflecting on that, Margaret, and you and I were talking earlier about that, in all fairness to them, they were a part of the National Center. They saw themselves as key advisors to the bishops. And so, in a sense, it was, I think, harder for them to realize that perhaps there needed to be changes in the organization as a result of their no longer being part of the USCC. But that was a critical, if you will, hiatus that perhaps they needed to gap, to change over, to cross over, to become something new. And but it didn't. Somehow they kept the same organization with, however, this exception. The Suzanne Hoff-Weber stayed for 6 years. And then she retired, and they hired Mike Librato from Gaylord, Michigan, to be the executive director. But around that time, the new president, the first female president of NCDD, Jean Marie Weber, decided that because she could hear some requests from membership that they wanted to see the organization change, so there was launched a bylaws committee to look at the bylaws, what changes might be made. There was also a critical success factor group that was looking at organizational changes. And in a couple of years, what she did was combine those two. So that was in place. So they were beginning to look at changes themselves. It wasn't entirely like they just ignored the fact they were no longer part of the USCC. They really were starting to say, you know what, maybe we should make changes, and so on and so. But a crisis occurs in 1990, and right after the annual meeting in Atlanta, their executive director, Mike Librato, decides to resign. And so that left them in the lurch with no staff, professional staff, other than an office manager. And so they begin the process of looking for a new executive director.
Oh. Well, it seems like NCDD was really going through a lot of changes. I'm thinking about the movement of Vatican II, the ripple effect of that, catechetical offices growing, roles in catechesis growing into DREs and all sorts of things. But also their own struggle in holding all of that, being dismissed from the USCC, trying to figure out who they are in that. I can see that the organization went through a lot to claim an identity or understand its identity, and I think that makes sense. But now we're at a point where you're saying we have no staff, we have no professional staff. So what do they do?
So what happened, Margaret, is that you have this board with no staff, and they're operating as their first independent organization. And they began to realize two things after the first couple of years. One was they were no longer as integrated into the National Center as they had been, number one. But secondly, they realized that the work of running a national organization was getting very hard for these volunteers, a volunteer president, secretary, and all that, and all the board members coming in. So what they did was they decided that they would like to have an executive secretary who would assist in the work of the board. And they were able to entice John Russell, the first president, to let go of that role, to leave his position as director of the Confraternity of Christian Doctrine in Syracuse, and to come to Washington and to be part of the National Confraternity staff. And that was worked out with Russell Neighbor, Father Russell Neighbor, who was then the director of the National Center. So the new staff person, in this case, John Russell, would be on staff at the National Center, working part-time for the center and part-time executive secretary for the NCDD. And so the center paid half his salary, and the organization paid the other half of his salary. So now they were more integrated, and so they felt that that was a very good solution until certain developments happened.
What happened, Neil? What developments happened?
Well,
You can't leave me hanging like
yeah,
that.
I know. That went on for a number of years, but then in 1981, the Bishops' Conference, which had, by the way, been restructured, so now it was a Department of Education.
Oh.
And so the National Center was now gone. It existed on paper, and we won't get into that why it was, but it was responsible for the Bible. So you may remember the Confraternity Bible. That's so they kept it as an organization on paper to handle the Bible. But the USCC now was an Office of Education, and it had schools, it had family life, it had adolescent catechesis, it had youth ministry, it had adult education, it had Bible ministry, and so on and so forth. So what happened was in 1981, the bishops, in a cost-cutting move, decided that there were several organizations, since they did have independent membership, they did have an outside revenue source, that maybe it was time for them to be on their own. So NCDD was one, and then the youth organization, CYO, was the other organization, and there was also a chaplain's office. So all three of them were asked to basically leave, and they were going to give it about a year and a half to make the changes and so forth. And what occurred was that NCDD decided, the board, that they really wanted to put this issue before the membership. What should we do? Because, Margaret, NCEA was aware of the development and had made an overture to NCDD. Why don't you come and join us? Why don't you be part of our organization rather than going independent? And so at the annual meeting in Los Angeles in 1981, the membership gathered, discussed those two options, and in the end they decided to stay independent.
Wow.
To go independent, as did the youth organization. They were independent. And so very interesting, in the summer of 1982, the staff member who was brand new, that was Sister Suzanne Hoffweber, who was hired to be the first executive secretary of this new independent organization, and Maggie Wilson Brown, who's now Maggie McCarty, those two staff persons at the USCC left, taking a desk, a chair, and a file cabinet.
And a membership.
And a membership. Two, they went to St. Paul's College across
right where
town.
we are filming today.
Where we're filming today. And they shared a common office space. And so there they started, both organizations. And I think that's a very interesting development, which you may want to inquire about, because I saw a difference in the two organizations and how they operated, you know.
Well, that's all great insight for us, Neil, because in November we're going to be gathering our representative council. And since our current board has committed itself to policy governance, we now get to wrestle with the representative council and what that means for us today. So even though it was drafted, I believe in 2008 under Mary Ann Ronan, it is now being resurrected and honored to really wrestle with the implications and the possibilities for us into the future. So I just wanted to say thank you, Neil, for this tremendous insight into the institutional memory of the National Conference for Catechetical Leadership. But beyond that, thank you for your brave, courageous steps to move the organization in a direction it needed to go. I really have been honored to know you and be mentored by you along the way. And
Thank you, Margaret.
I'm grateful that I get to follow in your footsteps now as the executive director, and I hope I can do justice to the role that you visioned.
Oh, I have no doubt about that, Margaret. But really the credit goes to the members.
It's true.
It really does. I saw my role as, since I was full-time, as trying to come up with ideas, initiatives that I thought would serve the organization. But it took the members to basically own them and have the courage to change. Change was not my authority, it was theirs.
Right.
So the various boards, the various members who voted for change are the ones who deserve the credit. They're the real heroes of the story of the legacy of NCDD to NCCL.
And I guess catechesis in the nation, period.
Indeed.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for being with us today, Neil.
You're welcome. So, the design I presented to that Critical Success Factor Group A had this idea of a smaller board, a representative council. I also changed the role of the president. What I did was I drew, Margaret, on the sort of the custom that I observed in nonprofit associations. Namely, instead of a 3-year presidency, they would go and have a, excuse me, a president-elect, then a president, and then a immediate past president. And what I discovered was why they did that is it got more people into the role of president, and it also relieved that key person from having to basically have the responsibility of chairing the board for 3 straight years. So you would have the wisdom of listening, or the benefit of listening, then presiding, and then offering your wisdom. So that was one of the other changes that we made. And what happened was that the Critical Success Factor Committee made some changes, but basically liked the idea, the framework that I presented. They then presented it to the board in Malibu. Some additional massaging was done, but then that went to the membership in Louisville in the spring of 1991. To my great delight, the membership voted unanimously to accept this whole new organizational change. There was only one abstention. But it was a unanimous vote other than that. So that's the beginning of what became NCCL. And by the way, the name was chosen the following year in San Antonio at the annual meeting. The organization members gathered there, went through a discernment process. And so they went around with different name proposals and so on and so forth, and eventually decided on the National Conference for Catechetical Leadership. Okay, that's how the name came. It was the following year. And then later that fall was the first representative council meeting in Kansas City. And so the organization was then fully flying at that point.
Wow.
Yeah.
It seems that at this point, with a new structure, a new way of operating, we needed to probably research and embrace visions of how we were going to function. You know, how are we going to professionally develop ourselves to function as a cohesive board? Or what next steps did you take to assist NCCL through that?
Well, there were several developments that occurred. Excuse me, you'll have to cut that out. What occurred was, first of all, the original design of the representative council never got off the ground the way I had conceived of it. Yeah, the incoming president really felt, who had served on the previous board, that big board, he just didn't understand how you could have the board not present in the representative council, because from his experience, the board ran the organization, I think, and so if it wasn't really part of that discussion, what's going on here? And at the time, I think I had conceived it intellectually, but it hadn't yet had the experience with it. So I myself couldn't argue the other side very forcefully because I wasn't sure myself how it was all going to work out. So anyway, you had the board and the representative council now meeting together.
I see.
And in retrospect, I think that offered contamination to both groups. It blurred what a board does, and it blurred the blue sky, creative, intellectual capital idea behind the representative council. And I think that's something maybe the organization might want to look at in the future, whether that's still good when you have your governance group meet within a blue sky group, because they can still get the benefits of the blue sky, but they have a different role altogether. And you want to keep roles clear. You want to keep your hats on your head in the same way you're supposed to be keeping them when you have a different role, you know?
Right. I think that we're probably at a good point to talk about that as an organization. We'll be gathering soon for our rep council meeting. Our current board has adopted fully the idea of governance, or policy governance. Can you tell me a little bit about our history with policy governance and your experience of that?
Well, I introduced the idea of policy governance back in that first representative council meeting in 1991.
Wow.
But it didn't come to fruition until some 15 years later. But that's okay, because in many ways there were so many changes. And by the way, I would like to say that the members and the leaders of NCDD were absolutely phenomenal when you think of the changes we went through, because there was still another change to come. And that was back in the late 90s. So we had now this new organization, NCCL, and it was launched in 1991, 92. And we had the representative council, the new way of electing the president, and all this sort of thing. But as a result of experience, I could see that we still needed a smaller board. And I would, through my learning again at workshops and through the literature, I could see that the constituency board that I originally conceived was really not the right direction to go. We need fewer members who could meet, who could, again, not have the need for an executive committee that makes decisions on its behalf. You want the whole board making the decision totally, not an executive committee. Also, a number of the presidents who had served in that 3-year sequence complained that they just got the feel for chairing the board when, in fact, they had to move on and become the immediate past president. So we went back to the idea of a 3-year term for the president. And also, there were other developments. The parish DREs, who we limited to being on the representative council with just a representative from each DRE organization, were saying, we want to vote. We want to be individual members. Why are we being excluded? So what happened is when Maruja Sedana was elected president back in the late 90s, I went to her as the executive director. I said, you know what, Maruja, I think we need further organizational renewal. These are things that I'm seeing from my position as executive director. And why don't we create a process called NCCL 2000? And that will be our re-examination of ourselves since the 90s. In other words, we've been here almost a decade. What are we thinking? What changes need to be done? And she was enthusiastic. And so she appointed Carol Augustine, the diocesan director in Baltimore, to head up that NCCL committee. And as a result of that, further changes were made. So we went from an 18-member board, constituency-based, down to a 9-member voting board, along with the executive director, the liaison from USCC, and the Episcopal moderator. We also now included DREs in full membership. We had other changes that we made, again, going back to that one of a 3-year term for the president. There was one thing I did try that didn't go. All the others went. The framework was basically accepted as Carol had presented it and so forth. And that was, I really wanted the name of the president changed to chair of the board. And the reason for that was president carries in our society executive connotations. And many of our members would think that, okay, we've elected a new president and that president really is running the organization. And that blurs the lines between governance and executive action. And I wanted that cleared up because many times it came to me, and even the presidents that got elected would call me and say, but shouldn't I be doing this? I'm the president after all. And so it was kind of always a sense of a little bit of misunderstanding or tension of who does what. But there were some people that stood up on the floor and said, no, president is our tradition and we want to keep that. But that was a disappointment to me because my whole hope was to help the person who got elected to understand that their role for what we called president was to chair the board. That's what you do. You chair the board and you exercise governance on behalf of the organization. You make sure this organization is going in the right direction through your policies and your oversight of the executive. That's what you do. And by calling yourself president, it blurs the lines. And so I just want to say, in fact, today in nonprofit, to try to get away from that, most nonprofit organizations now give the executive director the dual title of president and CEO. So to make sure that there's no misunderstanding. So anyway, that's something that didn't go in NCCL 2000. But we took the framework. The framework was approved in Louisville in 2001. In 2002, the new bylaws were formally approved by the organization. And in 2003, the first president to be elected under the new schema of voting, because also one of the things we did, this is interesting, Margaret, oh yeah, excuse me, but one of the things I noticed as executive director, I never liked seeing somebody vie for the role of president and lose. I just felt I saw them crushed. It was so hard because they got up there, they did their best, they said to the members, look, I want to be your president, and the other person said, I want to be your president. One of them lost. It's tough to lose to your peers. And I just saw, and in some cases, they just withdrew from the organization. And so I came up with this idea of a slate. Let's have the president whoever is the representative council says, you know, that's going to be one of our nominees. And that person went and then said, I want you to be my secretary, I want you to be my treasurer, I want you to be the vice president. So it's a whole slate going against another slate. And I felt what that did was you have two slates going at each other. It's not so personal.
Right.
So if your slate loses, it could be any number of factors.
Right. Right.
You're not diverse enough, you had the wrong person who goofed up, or whatever. But you know what I mean? And so we had to create a whole new voting system to make sure that slates got there. And always, all through the whole process, through all the years of my serving as executive director, what we tried to do was ensure that the diocesan directors never lost their founding, directing identity. So the new slate operating voting system, and you're familiar with this now than I am, you know, but was there to give the diocesan directors an extra vote so they could vote on behalf of their bishop's office. Mm-hmm. That was, again, to say to them, you know, you're important. You're the guys that serve as vicars for your bishops. We don't want you ever to lose your voice as we grow and made increasing numbers of DREs and so forth. You guys can't be outvoted because you're the founders of the organization. You're also the vicars for your bishops. Mm-hmm. You have to have a voice that we have to listen to. So that was how it was done. And so with that, you asked about policy governance. When Marianne Ronan was elected,
First PCL.
I introduced her to policy governance. She got excited and engaged that board for their whole 3 years in developing policies to run the organization. And so by the time I left, I retired in 2007, it was so exciting to me to know that there now was going to be a very clear demarcation between those who come from the membership to serve on behalf of the members in governance and from those who are representing the organization as staff and implementing the policies. Mm-hmm. I felt it was a clear demarcation, plus what it did, it gave both the board and the executive director clear policies that said, these are the things we want to accomplish, and here's the things that we know we have to do to accomplish them.